When did you start that?
And we can we can put it on YouTube channel. Edward. So we'll record them and it can go on YouTube channel. So you
Yeah, you can talk to him.
We'll record the presentations so you can pick them up on our YouTube channel. They'll be public. Okay. Well, I want to welcome you to the second annual Undergraduate Original Research Seminar in Questionarium. I'm Dr. Marley Switty, Professor of Surgery, Neurosurgery and Pediatrics, and Director of Student Research Programs at the College of Medicine. And Ken McAllister is my colleague here. He's Associate Dean of Humanities, unless you have another title.
That'll do for now.
It'll do for now. He'll probably get promoted during this session, right? And we've gotten together to resuscitate a program that was here for many years that funded about 1,000 students up until about 10 years ago, that provided similar kinds of grants. It wasn't based on questions, but it was cross-campus, and we had very, very interesting projects came from that. One of the graffiti projects went to the White House, the muralist who did that. We've had plays and other things come out of other projects that, in addition to a lot of publications and products. So it was a very exciting program. We're very glad. A couple of years ago, when the Vice President for Research, Betsy Cantwell, decided to start the program up again with a pilot grant to us. So you're the result of that, and you've had these opportunities because of this program. It started again and is funded by the research program here, the research office. Now, let me see. Okay, the assistants that we're having in, Neil Barnett is going to be the announcer, and Mindy Detton also helped in organizing this from Humanities. Okay, uncertainty is the watchword of our times, and the only way to approach uncertainty, people are finding, is to ask questions. So that what scientists have been doing for a long time, chasing after questions, now everyone is doing it in these chaotic times to figure out what's coming next. And they're finding that it's frightening, but it can also be exhilarating. And Francois Jacob, the Nobel laureate, said that this chase after questions, where the answers led to new questions, it was exhilarating. It was a provisional world, and it became his life, really. So that going from question to question, where answers lead to new questions, can be exciting. He said, I turned my anxiety into my profession. But actually, questions are popping up in many other ways. There's a Wall Street Journal headline that said that the Pope's legacy was his question marks. That is, that he didn't issue proclamations, but he raised a lot of very important questions. And that's bizarre thought. Yeah, the Pope's legacy, question marks. Now, we've been in touch with some of the Google Meisters who are working on making artificial intelligence more natural, so that maybe robots could be as good as monkeys, who certainly are curious. And they find that the problem in AI is that you can't make a robot curious. Also, ChatGPT doesn't know how to say, I don't know. And there have been, again, headlines in the Wall Street Journal about the lack of humility of AI, that it won't admit it doesn't know, it rather would give an incorrect answer and tell you it didn't know. So they have to infuse the humility that goes along with curiosity. And we're in touch with Ben Cerf, who's one of the founders of the internet, and hope to get into DeepMind to tell them about a curiosity pedagogy, which basically we've developed here, the curriculum on medical and all other ignorance. And we put on workshops around the world in everything from choral music to stockbroking and banking, art, history, as well as many science workshops as well. So that my being called the ignorama mama, the mother of the ignorance movement, sounds notorious, but it really, to me, is a compliment that we'd be able to do that. Now, also regarding AI, they had this article just the other day. It said, what does AI, how does AI think? The answer is it doesn't think. So here are the conundra of AI that you are exemplifying by your asking of questions. So we wanted to start off with everyone in the audience getting into the question mode. So we're going to hand out a piece of paper.
I think they already did that. Actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now, what you put as your question, put your name there, but don't necessarily put your research project. Put the central question, the fundamental question that you're interested in. It could be entirely different from what you actually did research on, or it could be a more general question that you're working on, or it could be not a research question, not a science question, but a question about society or a clinical question, something of that sort. So you have 5 minutes to put the question down, but just like in your applications, it has to be 10 words or less. And just think that he didn't have any problem asking the short question, what time is it really? And Lederberg, who was one of the great biologists, Nobel laureates of the last century, asked the question, are bacteria really cells? That's only 4 words. He was never asked for his favorite question, but he did the exercise as part of our summer program. He hand wrote, are bacteria really cells? And that is the fundamental discovery that led to the Human Genome Project. So that these simple questions can lead to very impactful answers. What I've done personally is to take my life and make it into a questioning clock. So I put the first research question that I asked for the first 10 years of my research career is, where does the fluid come from in the belly of patients who have alcoholic liver disease? And that led actually indirectly to some new treatments of babies with congenital heart disease who have massive swelling when they're born, but also led to some fundamental observations about the way molecules cross the capillaries. My second question was, and that's most of my life, I've continued to follow that question, but the one that we spent 10 years on was, how much spleen do you need to protect against post-splenectomy sepsis? After your spleen is removed, a certain percentage of patients will get this very overwhelming sepsis that they can die in a day when they lack the spleen. So we asked, how much of spleen do you have to leave behind so that you can prevent that? And the answer that we came up with 10 years later was a third of the spleen, as long as it's got a blood vessel attached to it. So we came with a very specific answer that has been used in avoiding taking the whole spleen out. Because the spleen, if it's injured, sometimes the whole spleen is taken out like an appendix and thrown in the garbage, but it has a very important function. And then the last question that I started raising in the 1980s is, what makes the lymphatics grow? We found in a patient who had a massive tumor, a benign tumor of the lymphatics that was extending from her chin down to her diaphragm and encasing all her organs. And no surgeon would operate on her except Jack Copeland, who was also the artificial heart icon here. And he was able to remove that tumor, and she had it all over her body and her skeleton and everything. And we were able to grow the benign lymphatic endothelium out of her tumor. And this was the first time that lymphatics were grown in tissue culture. And years later, this would lead to a whole field where thousands of papers are being published on what's called lymphangiogenesis. How do lymphatics grow and get inhibited? So there were very basic understanding came from some of those questions and some clinical observations. The patient actually is still alive over 30 years later. Just by removing that tumor, everything stopped growing everywhere else. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. We would not have anticipated that. But the fundamental question that I followed most of my life, and I think it was on my mother's knee, was how do you nurture curiosity? So here you are today. Hopefully, you were curious to start with, and hopefully the questioning process led you to understand that curiosity even better and hopefully become more curious. So we're going to ask you to 5 minutes to put down your favorite question. And we'll just wait for you to do that. And then we'll go on to the main vote.
I think most of them already filled it out,
Oh,
actually.
you ready, Phil?
Yeah. We have two new ones, so we can get you questions.
And we're going to look at that and we're going to be getting with subsequent questionnaire, we're going to be getting questionarium questions from faculty all over the campus. And we hope that each of you will help to organize student questionnaire. And then we're going to start to look at matching questions so that students can find mentors who have similar questions or they can collaborate in different ways, sort of a matchmaking, speed dating kind of thing. And we're working with data analytics to develop the algorithms to do that. So we appreciate this is the first time we're doing this particular part of the experiment, but we're going to continue to do it at the questionnaire that fall. Okay, so we're going to get started with the program and Neil is going to take over.
Before we get started, Dr. McAllister, did you have any words you wanted to say as co-PI?
I'll just note, I'm delighted to see all you and I've had a chance to read your proposals. I'm the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Humanities. My favorite thing in that job is that I get to work with faculty who started, like a lot of you, just asking questions. And one thing that I think Marlies didn't mention, but that Marlies is the international expert on, is not just asking questions to find answers, but asking questions, a kind of an ontological state, a state of being. You don't always have to look for answers, but you do have to be a person who can inhabit curiosity. Not necessarily with the drive to answer those questions, but you build this habit of just wonder. What is that? And sometimes you will pursue an answer, and many times it's just a way that you approach the world. Wonder why things are like that. Why things happen that way. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, and congratulations.
Yeah. Well, welcome everyone. You guys know me, most of you. I'm Neil Barnett, even if it's just through email, but I'm happy to see all of you guys in person. And if you'll notice from our program, this is our second annual event, and that means we do have some returning students, and it's good seeing you guys again. And one of them that's going to start off our program today is Coulter Thomas at the very top left. Coulter actually transferred, and so he's not here at the University of Arizona anymore, but he has continued his research and so graciously zoomed in. Coulter is now at Harvard, and he is in Zoom here, ready to present. Some of you that were here last year probably remember his research, but he is happy to share that again and any updates to his research. So Coulter, can you say hi and make sure we got you on here?
Yeah. Hello, everybody.
There we go. All right. Also, before Coulter gets started, one of the great things about this event, and we always kind of remark about it afterwards, is how interactive you guys are and friendly you are with each other and just kind of collaborative, which is the whole inspiration of this project, to be cross-campus, to share questions and to work together. So in lieu of that, in light of that, we brought the pizza and all the food inside. Please, during the presentation, if you want to get up and help yourself to more, there's no way that our staff is going to be able to eat this all on our own afterwards. So please help yourself, eat as much as you can. And just, if you do it between presentations, I'm sure no one's going to get insulted or anything like that. So don't be shy.
And one of our mentors just brought in Dr. Mitchell Bartlett, who is on our committee. He's also been a mentor to a lot of undergraduates. I might also say Rosemary, our assistants here, and Grace Ann Thompson helped to put this together.
All right, Coulter, I think we're going to leave the screen as is that we have now. So it's all on you. So take it away.
Oh, sounds good. Thank you, Neil. Um, I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Um, so my project is called the Watchtowers, Security and Surveillance Infrastructure in the U.S. Borderlands. Um, Over, the last couple of years, I've received funding from the Confluencer Center at Binational Migration Institute. Obviously, this program, which has been, I think, actually, this was the first grant funding that I got for my project. So very grateful. The Honors College and then the School of Geography. Um, yeah, ooh, there we go. So my research question is what was the extent of the United States Border Patrol surveillance infrastructure? And then how can this infrastructure be represented and communicated to public audiences? And then as the work has gone on, my kind of expanded question became what are the relationships between border infrastructure, migration, and the impact of surveillance infrastructure? So over the last 2 years, me and my research partner have driven the length of the United States border about 3 times at this point. And what you can see here are all of those little red dots are surveillance towers that we either found in person or after finding in person, we started scrolling through satellite imagery and found um, through satellite imagery. So a big element of this project was my photography. So what you're seeing are 3 images of 3 vastly different landscapes that make up the United States border. Obviously, this is not all of it, but the consistent element throughout these images is surveillance. Again, I think I might have skipped a slide. I'll go back very quickly. No. Um, Again, this is another image, speaking to themes that I'll get to later, but in redundancy and uh, unnecessary uh, resource deployment. Again, as my project expanded, we were mapping the relationship between migrant mortality and surveillance infrastructure. In this image represents, uh, well, the cross was placed for a man who died of heat exhaustion. He was a migrant. He was 38 years old, um, and it's within clear view of one of the surveillance towers. And so this image is symbolic in a sense, but it's also a very literal representation of the realities on the border. Um, this project has been a collaboration since kind of its beginning with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They're a pretty incredible organization that does a lot to protect digital privacy. And so they started the map, and we reached out to them and began working with them. And over the course of the last 2 years, we've found about 560 border surveillance towers. This is many different generations of uh, government programs starting in about the early 2000s, going, through today where it's expanding faster than it ever was. So in a big sense, that was the main uh, progress guidepost that we had for this project was getting a really conclusive map of this infrastructure so that we could understand and then future researchers could understand what was actually out there and then start to map and ask the questions about the implications of this infrastructure. And so my specific contribution is a visual archive of state surveillance on the border. And then over the last year, I had an exhibition at the U of A. And then last October, I had an exhibition at Columbia University in partnership with their Knight First Amendment Institute. Um, so that was cool. It was nice to get the work out there and have it be seen. And then also in the last, I think this headline that we can see down at the bottom also came out in October. So right before my exhibition, 30% of cameras in Border Patrol's main surveillance system are broken. That's a very important piece of the implication of this infrastructure that I'll get to in a little bit. Here's just one image from the exhibition at Columbia. It was a symposium on the invasion of privacy along the border. So at different checkpoints, how the border patrol agents are basically invalidating privacy laws. And then my element, which was presenting the surveillance aspect. And the keynote speaker for the symposium was the CEO of NPR, who's formerly the CEO, or I guess the president of NPR, who's formerly the CEO of Wikipedia. So it was very interesting, very cool symposium, some great speakers, and it was just very cool to be in a space with a lot of like-minded people who are interested in the work. So impact of this infrastructure has been kind of the enduring question. So through interviews with Border Patrol agents, migrants, and researchers have shown that this infrastructure, even its impact, even when it is online and it is functional, is minimal. Border Patrol just simply does not have enough personnel to respond to all of the detected activity that these cameras are picking up. And so some researchers have argued that this surveillance infrastructure has directed migratory paths towards more dangerous routes. However, in my experience, conversations and interviews with migrants, Border Patrol, and then just people who are familiar with the border, the physical infrastructure, so the walls, the fences, and agent presence, whether or not there's a Border Patrol agent who's visible um, or who makes themselves visible, exponentially has more influence on migratory routes than surveillance infrastructure. So going forward, this brings us to new questions. So understanding that the infrastructure really doesn't do more than project a facade of security, new research questions are needed to be directed towards the future. What can the future of policy look like? A future that balances the humanitarian costs of human migration with the security necessary at the border. Militarization has not solved the security risks or the migratory burdens, and clearly a new approach is needed. And these new questions revolve around what this may look like. In the meantime, a more realistic and attainable question is how can NGOs, local governments work together toward reducing the humanitarian costs of border politics? Uh, Especially at this time, doing what we can to improve the quality of life for the people that need it the most is most important. Um, yeah, so that's all I have for my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Coulter. Yeah, let me see. Let's see if Coulter can hear you. Otherwise, I might have to interpret it for you. If you want to come up here, you can. Yeah.
So I have two questions. Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I have two questions. The first one, I saw that in the map that you have showed with the surveillance points. There were like some like were concentrated at some points, and then there's like a big gap
Yes.
with no surveillance points. Is that like due to like geographical structure, or do you have any like inputs into why is that?
Yeah. So I wish I had a great answer for you, but the short answer is we really don't know. There's some basic things we can look to. So when we go out, oh, I'm pointing at my screen, but if we look over towards California and Yuma, that's maybe the first big gap we see. And that is really very, very barren desert. And so in one sense, it kind of makes sense why there's nothing over there is because it's really, really difficult to cross there. But there are also many other places on the border where it's extremely difficult to cross, and there are surveillance cameras. So I don't have a great answer for that section. And more recently, we've started to find some towers over there, still not filling in that gap, but getting closer to it. And then there's another gap in the bottom of New Mexico. That's another area that is very, very empty. Um, but again, not the only area that's very empty that doesn't have cameras, but it doesn't. So some of what our research has kind of uncovered that these are many different overlapping government programs that have provided funding for different systems, different contractors, and they don't always overlap perfectly. So they're filling in the gaps, or administration changes and the programs get cut. So sometimes these gaps are just the result of a change in administration and a lack of funding. And then the big gap in Texas is another one of those really, there's not much around. It's very difficult to cross. But there is still, and I'd almost say some of those areas have more of a civilized presence than what we see in Arizona and New Mexico, but still, we have not found any towers there yet. So I think part of it, honestly, is Border Patrol just doesn't want to go down there because that means they would have to live down there. It's very hard to get to. Um, but we also know that migrants are crossing in these places. The relative danger of these routes has not stopped them from doing so. And we know this through basically just discovering bodies. Which is a really awful way to have to know that this is happening.
Yeah, thank you. And I also had another question. Um, like you have the 30% of them where like the surveillance cameras were broken. Do you have
Yes.
any like is that because they're just like not taking care of them because of just like environmental conditions? Or it's like people just are like breaking them? Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always wondered why people, you driving around down here, like it seems like every road sign has a hole in it because people have shot at it. So it's not a common thing, especially there's some animosity towards the US government. Like, why aren't people destroying these towers? Because the general consensus is they're not being destroyed. They're just falling into decay, either by what I kind of explained last or for the previous question is these like changes in administration, lack of funding, lack of institutionalized knowledge, and just very harsh environments. And then some of these towers are 20 years old, which doesn't sound that old, but in the world of technology, that's extremely outdated. If you can imagine, computers from 20 years ago uh, are not compatible with computers from today. So then they have to keep updating all this technology. So it's not just the maintenance of their new towers, it's all of them, which is just the border. I really did not, I mean, you look at it on a map, but I did not realize how massive it is until you drive the whole thing. It's pretty incredible. And I think Border Patrol just is in over their heads with the scale of this infrastructure. And I've also heard from people in Mexico that there's a real fear of tampering with these towers because they know there's a lot of cross-border collusion between the Border Patrol and Mexican police authority, any authorities, and they don't want that type of attention drawn to them or their communities. So they really do try to avoid the towers.
Yeah, I think we,
yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
the questions, why don't we put the questions in the chat?
Oh,
And
okay.
then we can get them answered later, we'll record them.
Hey, Coulter, thank you for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And if you can stick around, you're more than welcome. But otherwise, we will Photoshop you into the group photo at the end. So
Sounds good.
it was great having you. And our next presenter will be Lennox. And let's bring that up. And I'm just going to leave it like this so you can see kind of them presenting as well, Coulter, if you want. Um, you know. Good. And then this is a clicker and there's a laser point on the top. Yeah, so you're good.
Thank you.
Let's put this. Yeah, you want to try it out, but it should work.
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Lennox. I'm in my fourth year here. I'm majoring in mathematics and I'll be staying next year for the Applied Math PhD program. So this project is the Lambert problem for orbital dynamics. I've been working on it with my faculty advisor, Professor Tanatiu Sanchez-Vijuet. And we want to thank the NSF and this program for funding this. Okay, so to start off, say you are on Earth and you want to take a little vacation to Mars. So both the Earth and Mars are in elliptic orbits around the sun. And what many people think is that you would kind of just get in the spaceship and drive it like a car, press on the gas the whole way to Mars. But really what's going on here is instead we take this purple transfer ellipse here and we free fall along that green portion. So the questions here, sort of the driving questions of this project, are what is the energy required to connect the 2 points in elliptic orbit? And how we get into this orbit is we sort of just throw the spaceship like a football. So it has the energy to get you out of the Earth, and then the rest of the way it's sort of just falling. So how can we find this energy, and can we describe the trajectory of this free fall using equations? So to formulate the problem a little bit, we have the Earth in its elliptic orbit around the sun. We set up these reference axes and we're measuring in polar coordinates. So we have r as the distance between the Earth and the sun, and then we have theta as the angle between the Earth and the sun. So we measure position using polar coordinates. We just use r cosine theta, r sine theta. And then angular velocity, which is how the Earth is moving around its elliptic orbit, is theta dot. And radial velocity, which is how the Earth is moving along the line closer or farther from the sun, is r dot. And to find the velocity, we just take a time derivative of position using the product rule. So how can we describe the movement of this system in terms of radial and angular velocity? So the answer to this question, we use conservation of energy and conservation of angular momentum to obtain this system of nonlinear first order differential equations. So we can solve these, and I've solved it by hand before, to get this equation for r in terms of theta. So this looks really ugly. It has some geometric parameters, such as the gravity and the masses. It has L, which is the angular momentum, and then we have this parameter epsilon. I don't know how to use this, which we call eccentricity, and that depends on the energy, the angular momentum, and the masses. So this equation looks ugly. You might not look right at it and know what it's describing. So what kind of curves is this equation generating? So we all are familiar with these conic sections. So if you take a plane and intersect it with a cone, you could get a point, a line, a circle, an ellipse, a parabola, or a hyperbola. So this is what that equation is describing, any sort of these conic sections. So how can we correlate a conic section to a specific value of eccentricity? And can we determine the energy that we would need for this conic section? So the answer here is yes, again. So in order to plan a flight, sort of think about getting on an airplane. There might be an exact departure time on your ticket, but usually that's not how it goes. There's weather troubles, there can be human error. So when you're planning a flight to space, you need multiple different departure dates. So on the x-axis of this plot, we have a variety of departure dates. On the y-axis, we have different arrival dates. And then the colors correspond to level sets, which are in terms of velocity, which can be translated to energy. So we have this equation at the top for delta t, so change in time, that is derived from geometric properties of your transfer ellipse and then just physical properties of the system, like the gravity and the mass. So to create this plot, each pixel on here requires one solution of the delta t equation. So each solution of that equation would require a few seconds to compute with a computer. You would have to code like a Newton's method or a bisection method. And this plot has hundreds of thousands of pixels. So obviously over time, this is getting really computationally complex. So can we create these plots faster and can we do it more efficiently? The answer is yes. One way to do this is to linearize. So in this example here, what they've done is they've plotted this grid of white points and they've solved the delta t equation exactly at those points. And then around each point, they use a Taylor expansion. So they're just taking information from that one point. And they've sort of tried to generate based off of information from this grid of points here. Maybe there's 100. So this method is good. It's less computationally complex, but it's not very accurate. So how could I improve upon this method? How could we do this? So the end goal of this project is to see how we can design a more efficient algorithm. So what we're trying to do is use higher order interpolation. So if you have those plots in the top with just the dots, we've solved it at exactly those points. First order interpolation would be just connecting the dots. Instead, we want to use higher order interpolation, where we take information from all of the points we have and generate sort of this smooth function. So our ongoing question, what we're looking into now, is how can we establish guarantees on our approximation error to make sure that this is not only faster, but it's also more efficient and accurate. Thank you.
All right, do we have questions for Lennox?
Yeah. Sorry? Well, I like applied math, and I guess this problem in particular was sort of an excuse to learn some higher order interpolation principles and some background physics. And if you look at these plots, you can see these aren't very similar, and higher order interpolation can make these look much better than this one. So I guess it was just an interesting problem, an interesting application. I don't know a lot about astronomy, but it's fun. Anyone else? Yeah.
Just curious if you've started to look at quantum computing and how that might change how you do this math.
I have not. I do not know about quantum computing, but thank you.
There are folks on campus who will be delighted, I think, to talk to you about.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
I like your shirt too. All right. Well, I used to be a teacher, so you know how this goes. Do we have any volunteers, or do you have to be voluntold to come up? Oh, you want to go? All right, nice. Teachers always love when we have volunteers. Also, we gave ourselves a little breathing room till 2:30, so we should be good on time, so you don't have to kind of freak out and go fast or anything. You can,
Okay.
yeah, take your time. All right, so let's bring this. Oops. That one. Also, as a note, some of you noticed and let me know that your title might have changed since, especially you returning students, of course, from what we have on the board. So we either used what you gave us in your application or what you had last year in your presentation, because some of you gave me your presentations like an hour ago or 2 hours ago, which is awesome. I asked for it, right? As a teacher, I said, give it to me before the presentation. So, 10 minutes before still counted, you didn't get deducted credit. But it means I didn't have time to go into the program and change it. So if your title is different than what we have in the program, then let us know. And it's kind of a cool insight into how your program, how your research might have changed over the past year, especially for you returners. So, and let's see, wait, yeah. Well, and it's an Adobe, so it should be.
Okay, yes.
Wait, point of view.
Awesome. So I didn't change the date on this because I actually had the opportunity to present these slides at a conference, which Tom was actually there for. Hi, my name is Shreya. I realized afterwards that there isn't a, hello, my name is Shreya. I'm with the Department of Physiology and Applied Humanities, and I studied adaptation of the health stigma and discrimination framework for Asian American mental health stigma and its reported impact on help-seeking behaviors. So I'm really thankful for this grant to help support this project, and I also had additional funding from the Honors College, and I would like to thank all my wonderful mentors who helped me for the research component of this project. So the exigence of this project was that in high school, I went to a very academically challenging high school, meaning I went to a basis high school. And it was a very unique time for me because we had just gotten out of COVID and it became increasingly obvious that there was a lack of mental health support resources needed for students at the school. Especially at the school that I went to, there was a very large population of Asian American students. And so in high school, that was when I first started to become interested in Asian American mental health. and understanding the unique factors that affect that cultural community and how that then affects people's willingness to seek help, and their ability to access help as well. So in my research for this particular project, I found that Asian Americans are an ethnic group in the United States that have some of the highest reported mental health need of any ethnic group, but the lowest reach for accessibility of mental health resources. They're also less likely than their white counterparts to seek resources when they are available to them, meaning that even if therapy is equally available and a American versus an Asian American student are of the same economic background and are of the same geographical location, the white student is 3 times more likely to actually successfully seek support for their mental health needs as opposed to the Asian American student. So this was really concerning to me as someone who's Indian American myself. That was something that was deeply personal to me, the people around me, my friends, my family. So coming here, I decided to specifically study the cultural factors that affect Asian American mental health stigma. The original question that I proposed for this grant was how does language affect Asian American self-advocacy for mental health? And then what are the psychosomatic effects? Originally, my intended plan for this project was that I would be conducting qualitative interviews, but I realized I was way out of breath and I needed to really conduct a comprehensive literature review to get my groundings first, um, to get my bearings first, especially because there's so much that goes into the cultural factors and the cultural experience of Asian Americans here in the United States. So a lot of my time actually went towards understanding that. So I conducted a narrative literature review that covered the Google Scholar database to identify studies that inform the relationship between help-seeking behavior, meaning behavior exhibited by Asian American students to seek help and seek mental health support, in association with the health stigma and discrimination framework. There's a lot of available frameworks out there to understand stigma and association with different healthcare experiences. But the reason that I went with this framework in particular is because it does a good job of not differentiating the stigmatizer and the stigmatized. In some communities or in some experiences, it's a lot easier to identify who is doing the stigmatizing versus who is being stigmatized or who's experiencing the stigma. However, within the Asian American community, people often act as both simultaneously, and it's very hard to separate that from their experiences with mental health because people often self-perpetuate stigma while also telling others that they shouldn't necessarily go seek support. This can be seen with parents or immigrants, first generation immigrants versus second generation immigrants. So I really wanted to get into all of that. And the health stigma and discrimination framework identifies multiple facets of stigma, ranging all the way from drivers and facilitators of that, all the way up to scaling that up to how does that affect like social practices and how does that affect the actual like health of individuals and more largely the community. So this is a narrative review table. Don't worry, you don't have to read this. But this kind of is just the summary of like all the sources that I looked at, what they specifically covered, and then you'll see in the rightmost column their affiliation with the framework or their relevance to the framework specifically. This was kind of difficult because there's not a lot of specific research that uses this framework in association with Asian American mental health stigma. So it was really important that I identified where each piece and component fit in. So don't worry, you also don't have to read this. But this is like the actual application of all of my research into the like framework. So everything you see in color, so like the red, the blue, those are the organizational components of the framework themselves, and then all of the black text is what I filled in as a summary based on my research. And you'll see like all of my sources are cited there as to what's important and where each piece of my information came from in trying to paint a comprehensive picture of what the Asian American experience looked like when navigating mental health needs. So the biggest thing that I wanted to focus on were the results. So major factors affecting Asian American mental health stigma and help-seeking behavior include unique to the Asian American community is expectations of success without struggle due to the internalization of the model minority myth. And the model minority myth is a myth that Asian American individuals are inherently more likely to be successful in spaces related to financial, like academic, finance, and career, just by virtue of being Asian American, that they're more predisposed to, like, being smart, and therefore they're more likely to achieve success. However, that kind of stereotype, often considered by many a quote unquote positive stereotype, there's no such thing as a positive stereotype. Often considered though by the public a positive stereotype because it's not, you're associating a considerably positive trait with the community. It actually reinforces the identity that Asian Americans inherently are successful. Therefore, if you are struggling on your way to success, then you are seemingly not doing it right because everyone else was able to achieve it with less struggle or less outwardly presented struggle. And then additionally, there's also the idea that if you have not successfully lived up to these expectations, then you are also simultaneously diverging from your cultural identity as Asian American. And that kind of cognitive dissonance is really difficult for individuals to deal with as immigrants here in the United States. So there's multiple levels of stigma that I looked through in my research. Internalized stigma means that people tell themselves that they should not be seeking help. There's perceived or anticipated stigma, meaning that they expect to receive stigma from those around them. A highly pertinent example would be second generation immigrants feeling uncomfortable telling their parents that they would like to seek therapy because they know that their parents personally did not ever think that therapy was an option for them. And then experience stigma, meaning that the stigma that people actually face within the community when they do try to seek help. And this becomes a very vicious cycle where individuals feel as though they can never receive help because the people around them won't seek help or the people around them aren't supportive of help. And the lack of normalized conversations within Asian American households make it very difficult for people to uh, talk about these kinds of things. And even though mental health is becoming an increasingly pertinent topic and a topic that we're increasingly normalizing within the healthcare space throughout America, cultural communities are facing a very, very different experience because the Western model of medicine isn't tailored to their understanding of their own health. Another thing that I thought was really interesting and ties back to my original question is that part of the reason that there's difficulties processing mental health need within the Asian American community is because there's different manifestations of and language regarding mental health distress. For example, idioms of distress is what my research mentor, Dr. Purnima Madhavan from the College of Public Health, what she specializes in. And idioms of distress basically say that different cultural communities communicate distress in different ways. For example, the original writer of idioms of distress, the original person who came up with this concept I think it was like the 1970s. They were looking at a community in India, surveying different communities there. And the literal translation of the way that sometimes they would describe distress or illness did not translate very well to the way that we understand distress and illness in the American healthcare system. So, for example, our modern understanding of anxiety clinically is parallel something called the thinking illness in India where they're I'm thinking too much and even though we can make that connection as historians and as humanities individuals studying that it's a lot more difficult to make that connection from a clinical perspective when someone who's only ever known it one way has to try and present their symptoms to a Western doctor. um, Another example is that Asian Americans are more comfortable recognizing psychosomatic impacts of mental health need and more likely to seek treatment for that. The Indian American community, for example, something that was really important to me is that the Indian American community has super high cardiovascular health need. And that's something that's been reported with high cholesterol, diabetes, high risk of heart attack and heart disease. And in part, that is, there's not enough tangible research that shows the relationship within the Indian American community specifically, that shows the relationship between mental health and cardiovascular risk. But we know that that's a thing that exists, that if you are stressed, if you have high cortisol levels, if you are facing chronic stress, then you are more likely to develop other diseases or other illnesses within your life. But Indian Americans are more comfortable asking for cholesterol medication or diabetes medication as opposed to seeking therapy, which might be the root cause of their original cardiovascular risk. So the conclusion is that Asian American mental health evaluation falls outside of the Western model of medicine, Western model of mental health understanding, and there's a need for like better culturally sensitive resources that actually acknowledge the unique experiences of the community. So my future research, the timeline of this project has basically been extended. My future research includes conducting qualitative, experiential, and key informant interviews to actually hear directly from individuals about their own mental health distress and the specific barriers that limit resource usage. I'm working with Pima County's health department to adapt culturally sensitive suicide prevention trainings. This is something I'm really excited about. It wasn't included in my original 19 sources for this comprehensive narrative review, but I did a lot of research on gatekeeper training, which is a training that lay individuals do in the community to recognize signs of suicidal ideation or mental health distress and help connect people to resources. People in your life that you might know who have to go through gatekeeper training would be, for example, residential assistants, so RAs, and like teachers will sometimes have to go through gatekeeper training so that they're able to, if they recognize a student is exhibiting signs of extreme distress, that they know how to say, hey, I can connect you to resources. With that in mind, Asian Americans have also seen higher levels of going to seek resources if they recognize that it's comfortable within their community. So if family or friends are willing to help connect them with resources, then it might be more beneficial for them to actually go and therefore seek them out. So I'm working with PCHD to develop culturally sensitive resource trainings that would allow family and friends to be better aware of how to maybe connect loved ones to help, which is very unique because that kind of resource doesn't exactly exist just yet. Just because gatekeeper trainings are available to everyone doesn't acknowledge the unique issues that regarding mental health faced within the community. And then finally, the Honors College has in part been funding the secondary component of this, which isn't even covered here because um, I don't have the space. But I'm currently working on an artistic and poetry exhibit to humanize Asian American mental health narratives. This will be drawing from the key informant interviews, but also draws from my own experiences as someone who's navigated mental health and someone who's experienced the mental health needs of my community very deeply. So that is all. Thank you guys very much. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
For the Asian Americans, you said the language could be like the barrier, if, like it doesn't translate directly. There's different, like there's different within Asian Americans. You can have like from China or India. How are you gonna address those differences within like with the language barrier and the translate?
So that's an awesome question. It's one thing that I think is really important is to recognize that Asian Americans is such a wide concept and that Western Asian Americans versus Eastern versus Southern, they're all very unique and have very distinct identities. The model minorityness is very highly not specific, but most applicable to the experiences of East Asians and South Asians. But specifically when we're considering language, the focus of my research is how like language and communication barriers within English. I don't have the capacity as an undergraduate student who does not speak very many languages to fully tease out the cultural nuances of how different things are translated. However, something that I have realized is that in communication in English, there's differentiation in language. For example, when Indian Americans are getting stressed, something that is very common is I have BP or I have sugar. Sugar meaning high blood sugar and BP meaning high blood pressure. And that kind of connects back to the psychosomatic impacts being emphasized as opposed to the mental health need. So the language component of my future research will focus more on how people communicate in English because that's all I really have within my capacity as an undergraduate researcher. Um, and I think it's most applicable to what I'm interested in doing with the trainings as well. Any other questions? Yes, Tom.
How do you foresee the the important concepts that you were talking about being incorporated into the clinical setting, where it tends to push a lot of, especially older Asian Americans away due to the disconnect, right? So there's a lot of talk about culture sensitivity and competency and all that, but how do you foresee future institutions kind of breaking down the barriers, right, between them and the very unique perspectives?
For sure. The first thing that immediately comes to mind is I think that like mental health is definitely becoming increasingly integrated into the primary healthcare space. Specifically, I know that like in pediatricians' offices, within the last couple of years, there's been a change to include like anxiety test screening or potential depression screening. But I also don't think that, or I think that it could be helpful to then train primary care providers to have culturally tailored conversations based on um, the results of those screenings. For example, I know that when I like had seen my pediatrician a couple years ago, um, they like just started doing the anxiety screenings, and my provider was trying to like communicate with my parents about the results of the screening, saying like, hey, like it could be helpful to like, maybe like it's not even like mental health support could be helpful for anyone, but I don't think that it was done as effectively as it could have been in terms of communicating how this was how they weren't calling me crazy. You know what I mean? Like that specific thing, or there wasn't enough damage control done in that kind of setting. So I think that in primary care settings, in order to take what I've learned from this and implement it into the clinical spaces, there's a lot that can be done with training doctors to have that like conversation, because I think that they've started to implement resources and they make sure that people are aware of those resources, but there's one more step of communication of normalizing and maybe like a little bit of hand holding, especially for communities that don't otherwise seek these resources out. Thank you guys.
All right. Do we have someone who wants to go next?
I go next.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Pham. I'm currently a senior at the university, which means I graduate hopefully in 2 weeks. My project this year is a kind of sort of a different approach from the one that I proposed last year. It was an awesome project. I did a project focusing on using PLGA as a drug delivery device for the eye, which is a very low cost and biocompatible sort of nanoparticle. It was great in the beginning, but I think it wasn't well suited to answer the questions that I had originally proposed. So I think it was more trouble than it was worth answering that question. So I pivoted to a different tool with a kind of the same application. So the big question that I tried to answer was that will formulating this drug moxifloxacin into something called an ionic liquid enhance the drug's permeability through the eye and thereby improving its effectiveness as a very important ocular antibiotic. So some background before we dive into the meat of the answer is that ionic liquids, by definition, are salts that are liquid form under 100 degrees Celsius. And salts, as you may have known, are compounds that consist of two molecules of opposing charges, a positive charge and a negative charge. And what I have here is sodium chloride, which table salt is the most classic example of a salt. And so with solid salts, they have assumed this sort of chemical structure that you may have seen before, and they're usually solid and crystalline and very ordered. What is unique about ionic liquids is that when you combine compounds of certain properties, but they can still have opposing charges, they will still form an ionic bond, but because of those properties, what happens is that they disrupt the solid crystalline sort of rigid structure that we see in a solid. That's why they're solid, right? And so you would get something that's more like a liquid, right? Something that disrupts this ordered structure to form something that's more fluid, more dynamic, something that is not as rigid as a solid. And so what you get is a liquid. So this was mostly used in the green chemistry world as, solvent to dissolve really complex plastics or to use in batteries as a safer alternative to, using battery acid. And some very smart people thought, hey, since most drugs are solid crystalline objects, why don't we make them, one of these two charges and turn them into liquid, right? And inherit all the great properties of a liquid, right? Something that's more fluid, something that seeps into membranes easily, while still retaining the biological properties that the drugs possess. And that's exactly what I did for my project. So it's not a novel idea, but I will kind of speak upon why my project kind of stands out a little bit. But I chose moxifloxacin as a candidate for my project because it is a broad spectrum antibiotic, meaning it targets different types of bacteria, gram-positive, gram-negative, you name it. It's actually one of the most potent in this drug class, which I think is pretty cool. And it is approved by the FDA as an ocular antibiotic. The problem with moxifloxacin is that it is very, very, very hydrophilic, so it dissolves really easily in water. And it might make sense that, it might work as a drug because your cells are mostly aqueous, right, inside the cell. But what happens is that in drug delivery, that doesn't exactly bode really well because what protects the front of the eye is, as you know, is a tear film, which is entirely aqueous. So as soon as the drug contacts the tear film, what ends up happening is that it dissolves into the tears and it either get removed through, reflex blinking or drainage through the system called the nasolacrimal drainage. So that's kind of the central problem of drug delivery is that how well do drugs actually work when given against biological membranes? So a real problem is that the prescribed treatment for this drug is 3 times per day in the eye. So it doesn't sound too bad, but that's 21 times a week, right? So you run the risk of introducing low patient compliance, right? Remembering to apply this drug 3 times per day, especially might be harder for older patients, right, who have a harder time managing their medication regimen on top of a lot of other drugs, right, that they're taking. You run the risk of introducing bacterial resistance to antibiotics, which is a very hard thing to reverse. And you also drive up the medication costs, especially in patients in third world countries where medication access simply is not as easy as we have it here in the US. So the central problem to solving this drug, though solving the problem this drug faces in the eye, is tackling how hydrophilic it is. So an idea that I had was what if we combine this drug with fatty acids, right? So they're endogenous, they're low cost, and they are safe to use in the human body because they're endogenous, right? So what differs my ion liquids from the traditional ion liquids I mentioned in the beginning is that people usually use components that do form liquids, but the problem is that they're usually expensive or just very complex chemicals that just are not safe to use in the human body, right? Because its original use was to use in plastics, right? So by using more biocompatible counter ions, we're able to form liquids that can be used safely in the eye that are accessible for people to use. So now to dive into the question, right? And that's to ask more questions. The first big question is that can this drug reliably form ionic liquids, right? That's an important proof of concept. We're able to show through NMR and IR instrumentation that yes, there's a strong ionic interaction between the drug moxifloxacin and the fatty acids that I used, right? And do they actually form what we would call a liquid, right? So we did X-ray diffraction, we did something called DSC, which means we put it in an oven and see how long it takes for the drug and the whole compound to degrade. And we found that, it is comparable with the original drug. So we were able to form moxifloxacin ion liquids, right? So it's always important to prove in chemistry that you are forming what you're claiming that you're forming, right? So the bigger question to answer now is that does it actually work? I say yes, it does. So the ion liquids that I created were able to show increased lipophilicity. So there is decreased hydrophilicity and increased lipophilicity, which is great because again, in the eye, it's not as simple as making something very hydrophilic. The membranes that protect the eye are lipophilic. So by making something that's more amphiphilic, you're able to sort of traverse the tear film and also still be able to easily diffuse the drug into the membranes that protect the eye, the cornea, the iris, all those structures. We did a study on pig cornea, which is one of the thickest corneas known to man. And how I did that was I basically applied the drug to the cornea and measured not only how much goes through the cornea, but then I took out the cornea, soaked it in methanol, and see how much actually goes into the cornea. Because if all the drug goes through the cornea and goes to the back of the eye, there's really not a lot of application to that, right? But what I was able to find was that there's almost a twofold increase in some of the liquids that I made compared to original drug in terms of permeability, which is what goes through the eye, and also did a study of what goes into the eye after 1 hour. And again, I was able to show that there's almost a twofold increase of the drug that goes into the eye. And most importantly, right, is this drug safe for use in the eye? And so I didn't have access to cornea cells. Those actually coming in this week, so I'm really excited to test them out. But I tested those on kidney cells because there's reported kidney toxicity of this drug, and I was able to see comparable safety measures in this drug in this ion liquid compared to original drug. So we're able to also prove that yes, these ion liquids that I'm making are safe for use against the kidneys at least. And again, I'm trying to see how well they perform in the eye. But with all research, there's always more questions that pop up, right? I am trying to engineer a real world therapeutic that addresses real world problems that can hopefully, lower the barriers that we face to bring these treatments to people, right? So the first thing is it actually effective, right, against bacterial species, right? Does this combination of this drug and these fatty acids hinder its efficacy? A lot of data has shown in ionic liquid engineering that there's really no difference. In fact, it makes the drug more likely to interact with the bacteria and the viruses that you target. Is it tolerable in animals and humans? Yes, I was able to show that it's safe in cells. I want to test this on rabbits, which have really big corneas, and so it's really easy to see how inflamed their eyes get whenever we apply these eye drops. And last but not least, right? Considering I'm using a really low cost, accessible method to create these formulations, can we translate this into different drug classes, anti-cancer agents, antivirals? I don't know, let's say like corticosteroids, right? Like, can we sort of use the same technology to tackle the problems that we see in all these different drugs so that instead of creating new drug molecules, which takes billions of dollars and 15 years to get approved, we can simply use things that already exist and sort of lower that wait time to maybe 2 years, 3 years, right? But that is my whole project in a nutshell. I'd like to quickly thank my PI, Dr. Abby Gate. He's a very ambitious mentor who's kind of taught me to ask a lot of more important questions and the sort of surface level ones that we tend to gravitate towards. Dr. Yes Chutar, who is a postdoc in my lab. Joe Adams, who is a PhD student. He's been my mentor for the past 2 years. That's him with a beaming smile in the picture. And last but not least, Arpita, who is a important research colleague of mine, who's also here today with us in the crowd. And of course, thank you to UBURP and the ASPEC program for funding my research the past 2 summers. And thank you to the committee in this program for affording me another opportunity to present my research this year. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. It's straight.
What was the difference between the 4 iterations?
Yeah, so I basically used 4 different fatty acids. Some of them were saturated, which means there's not a lot of double bonds. Some of them are unsaturated, which means there are double bonds that sort of hinder how rigid these fatty acids are. Some of them aren't even, some of them are just different classes of fatty acids. So it's like using different classes of fatty acids to kind of see how well they perform. And I can't exactly reveal what all of them are. I mean, one of them is, as I was showing in the previous picture, is oleic acid. I was able to see that saturated fatty acids perform far better with this kind of interaction than other fatty acids or other compounds that I used do. Yes.
Is this like combination with the fatty acid making the application of the drug more complicated onto the eye?
I wouldn't say so. I think usually how eye drops are engineered is that you have a drug, right? It doesn't dissolve well in water, so you have to add a solubilizer that dissolves the drug in water. Oh wait, the drug has to sort of, or the drug might degrade in water, so now you have to add a preservative, and you have to add all these different complex chemicals that are known to not be safe in the eye, but people still put it in anyways at low concentrations. So what ends up happening is that you end up with a lower concentration of the drug that can be applied to the eye. So with the addition of fatty acid, what I'm trying to prove is that not only does it make the drug more effective as a compound, it can also hopefully be more stable, which is a study that I'm trying to perform, is how well does it how stable is it over time, in air and water and different solvents that we use in the eye so that we don't have to add all these other chemicals to it. So I guess the end goal is to make it easier to use in the eye, easier to engineer, easier to formulate so that we can scale it up to, the manufacturer level and kind of um, solve those problems there. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So, let's see. Yeah. That's it. All right. Cool. So
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Rosie Esger. I'm a senior this year and I study law and Spanish. I actually just committed today to go to Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law to pursue my Juris Doctor after graduation. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm very excited to continue my cannabis law research there as well. They recently hosted this past summer the International Cannabis Bar Association's Cannabis Law Institute, and I was able to present my research there. So I'm very excited to partner with this institution and continue my partnership with the University of Arizona to continue this important research. So one of the first things I did in preparing for my cannabis law research was to research American cannabis law before I embarked on my abroad journey to Spain. So the important things to note about American cannabis law before we continue is obviously that it is federally illegal, but it is legal in many states. We're up to almost over 30 states now where it is legal, at least for private consumption and for sale in regulated dispensaries. So this is very different from Spain's cannabis law, which we will review now. All right, so my honors thesis, which is this project, so I was very thankful to be able to conduct this project under the funding that I've received from this board as well as from the Honors College itself. But so it included a survey that I created myself, and I surveyed 20 Spanish citizens from 13 different Spanish cities. And these were all in Spanish, of course. And then I also conducted interviews with 4 different stakeholders in the cannabis law community. And that included a professor of law at the university where I studied, a CBD shop worker, and another important note is that CBD, which is cannabidiol, is a minor cannabinoid, and that is different from THC, which is the psychoactive element in cannabis. CBD gives you more of like a body feel, and it's calming that instead of really affecting your mind. So those types of minor cannabinoids that do not have THC in them are legal. They are legal in the US federally, and they are semi-legal in Spain, as I learned from the CBD shop worker. Then I also conducted interviews with a Spanish prison chief of services and a Spanish prison doctor. So I had the very amazing opportunity to tour a prison, and I was able to discuss with an actual inmate as well, but I wasn't able to include that in my research, unfortunately, due to some legal issues with including that. But I was able to formulate a very interesting conclusion based on these interviews. I was also able to observe multiple CBD shops throughout Spain, and I observed about 42 throughout all of my travels. And this just entailed, I didn't buy anything or test any products, don't worry. But this just entailed going into the shops, speaking with the people that worked there about their experiences, especially their experiences with the local community and how they were treated based on their occupation as a CBD shop worker or a seller of what many people believe to be kind of like the devil's lettuce. And so it was very, very enlightening. The questions that were initially posed by my research were many, but the one that I centered on when I first began my research was how do these laws and these cultural perceptions, these regulations in Spain compare to those in the United States? But then I also asked myself, how does cannabis law in Spain inform consumption rates and the acceptance of cannabis, the public perception of cannabis? What are some recent developments in Spanish cannabis law? And what legal framework allows cannabis social clubs to operate in Spain? Cannabis social clubs are predominant mostly in Catalonia or in the Basque Country, and there were also some that I was able to find in Madrid as well. Now, these are very interesting segment of cannabis law in Spain as they operate quasi-legally. So the first progress report for my first question was about that legal difference. Spain and the United States take very different approaches to cannabis law. In Spain, cannabis is technically decriminalized for personal use in private spaces, but national laws lack clear regulation, and this places cannabis in a legal gray area. So in contrast, US cannabis law is marked by a sharp divide between that federal prohibition and state level legalization. Now, culturally, cannabis use in Spain is less stigmatized in some regions, as I mentioned, especially where cannabis social clubs are predominant. But in the US, perceptions vary widely based across states and demographic groups. Obviously, the US is a lot less homogenous than Spain is, although there are a lot of different ethnic groups and demographic groups in Spain as well, and I was able to survey a good portion. And there's also in the US influence of decades of prohibitionist policy, such as the war on drugs. Now, another progress report about the specific information that I found through my surveys is that because Spain lacks a national framework but allows limited personal use, public attitudes are shifting towards normalization and perhaps even in the far future legalization. This is especially true among younger generations. And in individuals between the ages of 20 and 40, that was the highest reported use of cannabis. That was the highest rates of use reported. But none of the participants over the age of 50 reported having used cannabis. So you can tell that my survey found that almost 50% of those surveyed supported full legalization, but those who had used cannabis were far more likely to support this reform as opposed to those who had not experienced it at all. Now, this legal ambiguity where possession is decriminalized but public use is still penalized means that social perception often fills the gaps left by unclear laws. And this means that cultural factors and regional experiences have helped to destigmatize cannabis a little bit and shaped public support for broader reform. The report about what are the developments in cannabis law was one of the most interesting parts of my research, and I actually I conducted a literature review that ended in a cannabis law review in Spain because these developments are so new and also very exciting for developing the legal framework in Spain, because as I mentioned, it is a gray area. But so we'll start in 2021, where the Spanish Supreme Court effectively ended the legal existence of cannabis social clubs by striking down a legal loophole that had allowed them to operate. However, most continued operations despite this ruling, as there was little to no enforcement of the court's ruling by local police or compliance by the cannabis social clubs themselves. Now, in June 2022, the Spanish Congress approved the Informe de la Subcomisión, which recognized the therapeutic potential of cannabis and recommended the regulation of medicinal use. This marked the first official authoritative acknowledgement of cannabis's medicinal value at the national level. Now, in early 2024 of last year, the Grupo Parlamentario Mixto introduced the Proposición de Ley de Regulación Integral y Control del Cannabis en Personas Adultos, which is a sweeping bill that aims to legalize and regulate cannabis for adult use, establish a national regulatory agency, and implement public health and educational campaigns. So as you can see, even while I was in Spain, there was a lot of development around cannabis law happening. Now, in conjunction with the 2024 legislative proposal, the Spanish Ministry of Health launched a public consultation process to gather citizens and expert input on the future regulation of medical cannabis. This step is part of a broader effort to ensure that any new policy is informed by public health principles and social consensus. So this was a very interesting development and very positive in regards to really clearing up the legal gray area around cannabis law in Spain. Now, what legal framework allows cannabis social clubs to operate in Spain? We kind of touched on that Supreme Court ruling that basically said no cannabis social clubs, but it was, for the most part, ignored. So CSCs, is as they're called in Spain, continue to operate despite that ruling. And this was due to a combination of the legal ambiguity, really, that regional autonomy that the Basque Country and Catalonia specifically is very for, and selective enforcement. So Spanish law decriminalizes private consumption and cultivation for personal use. But CSCs are obviously not in a private area, or at least that would be the thing that you would think. However, they go through a legal loophole by functioning as private member-based associations that collectively grow cannabis for personal and non-commercial use. So they get around this kind of private versus public by charging members a fee to join these clubs, and then that fee is used to cultivate cannabis. So they're not directly charging for the cannabis specifically, but they are charging a membership for the club, going through that legal loophole and allowing them to continue operating. So this is not explicitly legal, but they're not criminalized if it's kept within informal limits. Really, police go against large scale operations. So CSCs continue to challenge these restrictions in court, and they advocate for clear national level legislation that would regulate their operations. The legal community remains divided, and ongoing proposals in Parliament suggest that the future of CSCs may be codified rather than curtailed. So this may mean that there will be another ruling that goes against the 2021 Supreme Court ruling, saying that CSCs are legal and here's how they can legally operate. Currently, there is not really a framework for that. So as I concluded my thesis, there were lots of new questions that emerged for me, including how will Spain balance regional autonomy with the need for national cannabis regulations? What regulatory models, such as those in Amsterdam or the US, could effectively inform Spain's future policy? And can Spain implement a cannabis framework that prioritizes both public health and economic opportunity while minimizing illicit markets? If you'd like to find my research, it's in the honors thesis repository, and I included the link as well. But it really does have a very thorough. We have that law review about what are these CSCs doing and how are they doing it and how is it legal or how is it not technically legal. And then I also have the transcripts from all of my interviews that were translated by me, and as well as the findings from those interviews and some of those graphs that I showed you as well. So anyways, thank you guys so much for listening to my research, and yeah.
I think we're going to save the questions at the very end if you want to ask each other in person, just so that we can make sure that everyone has all the time that they want to present their research when they come up here.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone want to go next? Okay, awesome. Left, right, later. If you go over here, it'll do feedback, but I'll try to turn that off anyway.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bhargav Ghosh, and I'm a junior majoring in molecular and cellular biology. And I work in the Vedantam and Viswanathan labs here at the U of A. And today I will be talking about my project, which is about a conserved regulator which controls C. difficile infection trajectory. So C. difficile, otherwise known as Clostridioides difficile or C. diff in the hospital, is a CDC urgent threat pathogen, which basically means that it's prevalent in healthcare settings due to an increasing resistance to conventional antibiotics. Furthermore, all vaccines have failed clinical trials and current treatments are ineffective. There are over 500,000 infections each year in the US, both from the hospital and in the community in general. Over 80,000 recurrent infections after primary infection, and 30,000 deaths due to C. difficile infection alone, as well as many more deaths due to complications. So the C. difficile bacterium, it's gram-positive and grows in anaerobic environments, basically meaning that there's no oxygen, especially in the gut where it infects the host epithelium. So it infects with 3 primary virulence traits, which we'll be talking about today. The first of which are spores, which are the infectious particle. Basically, they're very environmentally resistant and can stick to surfaces. For example, you can imagine in like a hospital bed or on like a desk in the hospital before they're transmitted orally into the host and then they infect. Then in the colon, there's secretion of toxins A and B, which are glycoproteins which disrupt the host epithelium and cause cell death. And this leads to symptoms of diarrhea in patients, and it's very characteristic of C. difficile. And finally, formation of biofilms, which are essentially really thick layers of cells, spores, and extracellular matrix, which causes those recurrent infections we were talking about earlier, as well as pseudomembranous colitis. And because of this, targeted therapeutics require further investigation. Because of this increasing resistance to conventional antibiotics, failure to eliminate these biofilms leading to many, many recurrent infections, and then a growing risk of global outbreaks due to multi-drug resistant strains. So there's this need for targeted therapies against primary as well as recurrent infection. So now kind of transitioning to the more molecular biology approach of my project, we're going to be talking about transcriptional regulator proteins, which basically are proteins that are in cells and can regulate gene expression, controlling organismal behavior. For example, metabolism, virulence traits, etc. And the specific family I'll be talking about today is the Araceae family of transcriptional regulators, which have a DNA binding domain with the helix turn helix motif that's pretty characteristic of prokaryotic regulators. And they've been shown to regulate metabolism, stress response, and biofilm formation, and virulence in many bacterial species. However, there are 21 of these Araceae homologs in C. difficile, especially in the more clinically relevant strains, but none of them have ever been characterized, let alone in the Clostridial species in general. So there's a absolutely massive gap in the knowledge in the literature as to what these can be doing in C. diff in particular. So our original question, which we tried to answer last year and this summer, what is the role of the Araceae type regulators in C. difficile virulence? And specifically, we chose one regulator, RS12175. And how does this specific regulator impact virulence? So first, we kind of went to a more data-based approach in silico analysis. So here we have an AlphaFold prediction of the protein, which showed a lot of homology with different types of proteins in different bacteria. And then on the right, we have a sequence alignment chart of different homologs of this specific regulator with other regulators in other Clostridial species. For example, we have C. diff up here, and then in red, we've got tetani, which causes tetanus, and then botulinum, which produces Botox. So all 3 of these are very clinically relevant strains, and as we can see here, there's a lot of similarity in your amino acids as you go along, suggesting that there might be a conserved function amongst Clostridia in general, not just in C. diff. So then what we did is we wanted to kind of attribute what is happening to the virulence attributes. So what we did is we overexpressed this gene on a plasmid, basically meaning that we have way more than we would usually expect to have in the cell. And we see and screen for what might be changing. So in biofilm formation, we saw a decrease with overexpression. And then we also saw a decrease in toxin production as well. Interestingly, we also saw a decrease in spore titers, which is interesting because you don't really see all three virulence traits being regulated in the same direction, just because of the way that the disease trajectory works. So this was kind of our clue in that this protein definitely is contributing to all three virulence traits, but obviously this is in vitro. What can we figure out in vivo? So we also created a mutant strain where we inserted an erythromycin-resistant gene into the cassette into the gene, basically disrupting the protein. So we don't have the protein in it. And without the protein in the mutant here, we see an increase in toxin production, which matches what we saw earlier. If we have too much protein, we have decreased toxin production. If we don't have it at all, we have increased toxin production. Furthermore, this is just qualitative data, but we know it also can increase your spore titers. So these live cells here are going to be these dark bacilli, very long, very dark. And then your spores are going to be these phase bright particles. So at 24 hours, we can see far more spores in our mutant strain. And then at 96 hours, when we would expect to see a lot of spores popping up, it's absolutely just been engulfed by spores compared to the wild type strain. We haven't tested the biofilm formation with the mutant strain yet, but that's going to be ongoing. So then we wanted to figure out, we know this is all happening in Petri plates and in 96 well plates, but what is actually going to happen in a mouse model of infection? So mice are generally the colonization model of C. diff infection, so we don't expect to see any death. However, we can track their weights and see if there's any changes in disease trajectory. So in the black line here, we see the wild type infected mouse, which shows a pretty standard trajectory where you have a decrease at 3 days post-infection and then a recovery. However, with all of our 6 mutant infected mice, we see a sharp decrease in weight for all 6 at day 2 to varying degrees. However, 5 out of the 6 recovered by day 3, and then 4 out of the 6 lost weight again at day 4, which is really interesting because we see a primary infection with, on average, a much larger decrease in weight with some variability, recovery, and then a recurrent infection potentially at day 4, which we don't see in the wild type. So far, we know that RS12175 has close homologs in other clostridial species, so there might be some broader relevance there, including botulinum and tetani, which are very relevant. And then we know that overexpression decreases virulence traits, and an insertional mutant will increase virulence. So we can definitely attribute this to being some virulence phenotype. Furthermore, we know that mice infected with the mutant strain experience early onset weight loss and possible recurrent infection. So as we talked about, a very altered disease trajectory from what we would normally expect. So what new questions do we have? So how does this alter C. difficile infection in an acute model of infection, which is something that we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks with a hamster study where we use infect hamsters instead of mice, which would be the more acute model of infection. Furthermore, how does this alter the transcriptome of what genes are being expressed or not? So this will be something I'll talk about in a slide or two, but basically very exciting work going to happen there. And then how can we use in silico analysis to understand of the 21 RSE regulators in C. diff, we've talked about one. Can we get a general understanding of what the other 20 could be doing to make our life easier in the future? We know what to look for those as well. So I'm very fortunate to have recently been awarded the Bravo Fellowship for this summer. So that's where a lot of my transcriptomics work is going to come into play, looking at which genes are up and down regulated by this mutation. And then also biofilm analysis to understand what inside the host is leading to infection, especially relating to this gene. So this is all working at the Pasteur Institute this summer. So I'm very fortunate for that. And I'd also like to thank Allison, who's here today, as well as my research mentors and all of my various funding agencies. Thank you.
All right. Who wants to go next? Oh, okay, awesome. Oops.
Just to go.
Mhm.
Hi, my name is Kanishka Shnaraj. I'm a senior at the University of Arizona, and I began this project last year in October with Dr. Cowan. And the research question here is talking about the effects of pulse sequence variability of electrical brain stimulation impact on the time course of dopamine release. So a lot of words, but essentially what this is talking about is and looking into is dopamine and how fast it'll be released based on different electrical stimulations in the brain. I got interested in this work because I was involved with Parkinson's research earlier with Dr. Cowan and learned a lot about dopamine and that research. And we kind of talked together about what we could do next. And we both thought it would be really cool to be able to track the release of dopamine. And so dopamine here has many roles in the human body from motor control, learning memory, and motivation. And varied levels of dopamine release can affect the activity of different target cells. And the electrical brain stimulation component is essentially a surgical process used to investigate neural systems involved in guided learning and decision making. Interesting thing is that EBS or electrical brain stimulation is also used as like treatment for individuals who have a lack of dopamine release. And kind of the idea here is that it's used in fixed interval frequencies. And what we wanted to explore was what would happen if we had random, periods of stimulation instead of something that's more rigid and has structure. So the question initially began with, again, little is known about the randomness of EBS frequency, which involves frequency, variability, and like the brain region that's being targeted. Um, so the first aim was how does electrical brain stimulation frequency and pulse sequence variability modulate the time course of dopamine release? And then the second aim for the project was to figure out how the time course of dopamine release is affected by natural reward systems. And is that going to be different than the dopamine that's being released when you're electrically stimulating the brain? So how did we do this? Just to kind of the overarching kind of theme for this entire project is that we ran into a lot of issues, which is normal when you're doing such science related projects. So we began by injecting a virus called D-Light into the nucleus accumbens of the rat in both hemispheres. And again, this is a picture of me doing surgery, which was something I was super grateful to be able to be trained in whilst working on this project. And so once we inject the rat with the virus, we have to wait around 2 weeks to 3 weeks for the viral expression. And then we do a set of control tests to see if the virus is actually expressed. And once we're able to confirm that, then we go ahead and we insert an electrode into the medial forebrain bundle. And we essentially stimulate at a certain level of frequency. And then we record the amount of dopamine that's being released from the nucleus accumbens through photometry, and then we analyze the data. So some initial issues, again, since it's such a very lengthy process of completing surgery and then having a successful surgery, first of all, having the virus actually being present in the rat. We ran into a lot of initial problems where the virus just was not working. So we learned later that our D-Light virus initially was not the best choice. So we moved towards a different virus called GraphDA. And then the second issue was kind of figuring out the photometry system. It was a new thing that we started in our lab. We're the first project working on this. Didn't really know how to use the system, which is waveform, and also the tools. So there's a big learning curve there. And we worked with another lab and kind of talked to them about how they did stuff. So a lot of collaboration. So that's kind of how last semester kind of wrapped up, and earlier last spring and then over summer. So what are we doing right now? After we kind of got the initial thing sorted out, we were able to collect some good data about the dopamine release in the rats while they were doing food reward tasks. So these are graphs. The top row is the first set of trials, and the second row is the second set of trials that happened a week apart. And these are in 3 different rats. And so as you can see, there's 10 trials when you look at this horizontally on this graph. And the yellow dots or sections is when the dopamine was released. And like the dotted line that goes down the graph is when the animal got a reward, when it was in a linear track going back and forth. And as you can see for rat 1, for week 1 and week 2, the data is pretty consistent in terms of when the dopamine is being released among all of them. So this one is released as soon as it gets a reward. There's a release of dopamine. For rat number 6, as you can see, it's pretty interesting. There's like a 10-second delay from when it receives a reward to when it actually has a release of dopamine. And then for rat number 10, you can see that there's a longer duration of dopamine release. Again, don't really know exactly what all of this means right now. We're just like starting to get some data, which was the big struggle in the initial time period. So we have to do a lot more trials and testing to figure out what exactly all this data means. But we're happy that we're able to see the release in the first place, and we got the system to be working. And this is showing kind of just seeing if the rats have a preference to the right feeder or the left feeder. And there's not much preference, just for the left one, there is a little bit more dopamine release. So again, just collecting the initial parts of the data for this research. Some new questions is later seeing how the level of effort for getting the food reward is going to affect the dopamine release. So we're going to start to have inclines on the linear track and see if the angle or a greater angle will impact the amount of dopamine that would be released when the animal receives the reward. And then also altering the probability of when the rat will be receiving the reward to see if that's going to affect their time course of dopamine release. Again, the problems that we're facing right now is a lack of motivation in the rats. They don't really seem to care that much about the food that they're getting. So we may have to train them in different ways to make them more motivated. But yeah, and then some benefits that I got from being able to be a part of this program and get this grant money is first we were able to use it to buy the viruses, which are pretty expensive. Also, I got to go and present an SFN last semester in Chicago, which was really, really interesting and an incredible opportunity to be able to do so. Being able to learn surgery techniques, which was always something that I wanted to do, and I was able to learn how to do craniotomies and insert the probes and everything this past summer. And also being able to be part of a collaborative effort with all the PhD students in our lab and our PI, who has been incredibly amazing with mentoring me in this process to answer scientific questions. And this is just a picture of me at SFN. And this was actually for a different project. This was for the Parkinson's project that I was able to go for because we were still not having enough data for this current project, but nonetheless was still an amazing experience. So thank you. Any questions?
All right, who's next? Oh, we'll do it after, yeah. Okay, awesome. All right. Ready? Wow.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, pointer this making.
Yes, that's what you find. Yeah.
Okay.
Then if you see here, well, that's
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Carmen Sanchez and I work in the field of developmental biology. I'm currently a junior at the University of Arizona. And the question I'm going to try and answer today is how universality and specificity come together in order to build an organism. We find universality through the different components that have to come together to form a singular structure. And these components are formed by the same building blocks, which are cells, that they have the potency to exhibit the same cellular behaviors. However, where these components are going to locate and the time that they're going to form is highly specific and fundamental for developmental biology. So how can we have both things integrate in order to build an organism appropriately? In order to answer this question, we first have to establish the universal processes that are behind the development of structures. So at the start of early in development, we have a homogeneous field of cells that aggregates into what's determined to call cellular condensations, which are just cellular aggregations, from which cells then differentiate into specific tissues. So although it's known that cellular condensations are prerequisite for cells to differentiate into specific tissues, what it is not known is how this homogeneous field of cells is able to form the cellular condensations. In my lab, we proposed 4 different mechanisms that could help explain how this process occurs. So we could have either cellular direct stream of cells migrating towards the future condensation site, a more general migration from the surrounding mesenchymal tissues towards the future condensation site, either a higher proliferation of cells at the future condensation site, or a interaction between physically similar groups that would help organize this homogeneous field of cells in order to form the cellular condensations. To test this for different mechanisms, we developed this program in the lab where we automatically collected histological, protein expression, and cell morphology data in slides of bird beaks of embryos ranging from stages 25 to 36 in development. And we used a scalable grid, the one that's shown right here. So we were able to maintain position over time. We divided the data into 5 different categories right there, which was condensation, boundary, mesenchyme, epithelium, and signaling epithelium, all different components that could aid in the formation of the cellular condensations. And we studied their physical and chemical interactions at 2 different stages before condensation was set and when condensation was established, and how these physical and chemical interactions changed over time. And we also recorded the location of where these condensations were going to form. So by contrasting the change in cellular morphology before condensations were established and when condensations were set, we were able to determine that the increase observed in cell density in the cellular condensations were due to a general migration of cells towards the future condensation site, followed by a proliferation of cells at these areas. And this is seen because there was a decrease in cell density in the mesenchymal tissue surrounding the condensation, so that would be boundary and mesenchyme. And then there was also a decrease in polarity variation and an increase in roundness from going before condensation was established to going to condensation. So this all correlates with the cellular migration that was happening from before condensation was set towards the site where condensations are going to be established. And then we knew that there was proliferation happening because the change in cell density before condensation was set to when condensation was established in the condensation tissues was so great. And that couldn't be explained by this. It couldn't only be explained by this migration of cells. We also had to have some cellular proliferation happening there. However, these mechanisms don't apply for the specificity that is seen in these structures. Like we know that these universal processes of cells that they're migrating and then cells that are dividing, all these processes could happen anywhere, but they don't. They only happen in specific locations in the beak. So now the question is, okay, well, what determines where cells are going to migrate and where those cells should exhibit a higher rate of proliferation? And that's the question that I'm going to try and answer further in my research. And lastly, I would like to thank all the members in my lab for their support and guidance, and the R2 student or junior research program for their financial support. Thank you.
All right, Tara, you want to come? Yeah. Audio should work. Great. Fingers crossed. And then if you stand over here, you should get less feedback.
Okay, sounds good.
And then left to right.
Perfect.
Cool.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tara, and I'm a senior here at the University of Arizona. My affiliation today is with the Department of Spanish and Portuguese in the College of Humanities, and I am presenting just a snippet of my honors thesis research, which is on the perception and processing of lexical stress, Spanish lexical stress by English-Spanish bilinguals. Okay, so to give a little bit of a background, what lexical stress is it's the emphasis that is placed on syllables within a word. Super simple. And Spanish stress is contrastive, and what that means is that the stress that we place on syllables can change word meaning. So I've got a couple of examples listed here. I think that's the easiest way to conceptualize. A popular example is the difference between papa and papa. Stress there changes the meaning of a word that otherwise would look the same as another, from potato to dad. So gotta be careful with stress and where it's placed. Stress is differentiating in a lot of ways. In Spanish, it can differentiate word meaning noun to noun. It can differentiate tense, like we see with canto, I sing, versus canto, I sing. And then I think a pretty impressive example is this third one here, in which an adjective, a verb, in present tense, and a verb in past tense are differentiated on the basis of stress placement. So in English, we also have stress in a little bit of a different way. English also has contrastive stress, but at a much lower functional load. So think, for example, like record, like you go to the record store and buy a record versus the verb record. That's an example of stress, changing word type from maybe noun to verb. But we see, like I said, a lower functional load, so just not as many occurrences. So as far as research, I did a lot of reading. I spent probably a semester and a half just reading, and compiling information in preparation for my research on lexical stress and on different methodologies. Dupont has a number of papers out on contrastive stress, and his research shows that speakers of languages without contrastive stress, like French, struggle to perceive stress contrasts when they're presented with them. There is a little bit more of a gap in our understanding of English-Spanish bilinguals and their variability in stress perception. There is a little bit of existing literature there, but it uses primarily like non-words and isolation. And my research utilizes real words to hopefully provide a more broad understanding, I suppose. So the implications are a little bit more natural speech geared. So my question was, do L1 English, L2 Spanish bilinguals, people that learned English as their first language and Spanish as their second language, perceive stress contrasts in real world context the same way that L1 Spanish speakers, native Spanish speakers do? So I had the opportunity to work with an awesome faculty member in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Mikel Simonet, and his Arizona Applied Phonetics and Psycholinguistics lab. And we, thanks to this grant, were able to build experimentation online via Gorilla and deliver it to participants via Prolific. So from a remote format, data from 80 participants were collected. 40 native Spanish speakers are L1 Spanish speakers from Mexico, and 40 English Spanish bilinguals from the US who learned Spanish as a second language. So Prolific is super neat in that you can pre-screen participants to kind of fit certain demographics, and it was fun to learn this program. So our screen participants entered an experiment in which they completed a headphone check at the Spanish Lextail, which is kind of a test of vocabulary breadth that correlates to Spanish proficiency, a two alternative forced choice task, an ABX task, and a language background questionnaire. In an effort to tell more of a story as opposed to information dump, I've chosen today just to kind of focus in on my 2AFC, my it's a tongue twister, alternative forced choice task. So to zoom in on that, what is the 2AFC? Essentially what participants are presented with on their computer screen, their desktop screen from home, when they sign in to this experiment database, is first a consent, their vocab test, the Spanish Lextail, and then this experimental task. They hear a word fragment, the first two syllables of a real word in Spanish, and have to decide which of two displayed words it corresponds to. So for example, participants might hear something like suce and decide whether they heard the beginning of suceso or sucesión. It's a tricky task. What it boils down to, though, is that the task is not a matter of word recognition, but a matter of guessing a whole word from a fragment, and lexical stress helps to disambiguate this. So in essence, 2AFC is a measure, it gives us a metric of lexical stress perception. So I thought it just sounds like a lot of words. It's super conceptual until you see it on the screen. So I thought I'd do a little example here of what participants would see when they're completing this experiment at home. There's a whole bunch of trials, I think about 120 for the 2AFC that are controlled for order. And the flow goes like this. There's a target on the screen, a focus target, and then my fingers are crossed that audio will play. It's going to be super quick and hopefully audible. But participants would hear something super short like that, and that's the first two syllables of either incendio or incentivo. In this case, it was of incentivo. Kind of crazy, kind of hard. I have another example. Could be espectro, could be espectáculo. For our, well, it is a hard task, and that's what the results show. For our L1 Spanish group, we had an average accuracy of 67% on this task, which shows its difficulty, but relative to the accuracy of about 53% for our L2 Spanish learners, the L1 English L2 Spanish group, we see a statistic significance. Our 95% confidence interval does not overlap in either the lower or upper bounds between the two groups, which definitely differentiates their tendencies and tells us some interesting inspiration. I am full of tongue twisters today. Interesting information about how these two groups perceive lexical stress. So the immediate difference that we see is that native Spanish speakers are notably better at using stress patterns to distinguish between real words. 67% might, like I said, not sound super impressive, but relative to our 53% and the other experimental group, it's definitely noteworthy. The lower accuracy of bilinguals, which sits just above chance, indicates perhaps persistent challenges in processing lexical stress. And this has some interesting interpretations. Like I said, it's obvious that there were some measurable difficulties of stress contrast in real world tasks on the part of bilinguals, second language, or yeah, L2 Spanish learners when making direct word identification decisions, which tells us that maybe first language shapes sensitivity to stress. And this does kind of agree with what existing literature has to say about stress perception. Also tells us that second language Spanish learners might experience subtle processing delays when handling stress contrasts. So as far as continuing questions, I brainstormed a couple of things that I think would be neat to consider, but really my next objectives are to fully flesh out the rest of my results. In addition to accuracy, reaction time was also measured for participants in both the ABX and 2AFC tests. And I think that'll be interesting to consider alongside accuracy as far as perception versus processing, and maybe the insight that reaction time gives us into processing versus perception. So that'll be super cool. And then it'll just be fun to get everything combined, synthesized, and analyzed in the next couple of weeks. So one huge thank you to the RIA sponsored campus-wide undergraduate student-initiated original research program. I wouldn't have been able to pay my participants to recruit so easily and quickly via Prolific if it weren't for the funding from this program. It's been awesome to learn new programming, and I see lots of research applications in my future as a result of the learning that occurred because of this grant. Additional thanks to my advisor and to the Arizona Applied Phonetics and Psycholinguistics Lab. I don't know if they'll have access to this or care to watch it on YouTube, but I've seriously been so fortunate to learn from scholars that are a little bit further along in their academic journey than me. I think asking questions throughout our lives is super important, and I love this program's commitment to curiosity. Thank you. Thank you.
Audience, great.
Great.
All right. I think we have just one more because Jesse's not here, right? I think Jessie had something come up, so she wasn't able to make it. So I think we have just one more presentation left. Yay. If you stand over here, there'll be less feedback.
Hi, so my name is Yane Romero, and I'm also with the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And my research project is based on the question, how do bilingual healthcare providers affect patient satisfaction and medical knowledge among Spanish speakers in our community? And so basically, a rundown of my project, I offered a survey to around 26 participants. Half of them were Spanish speakers with an office visit with their primary care provider at Subida, and it was an English speaker with an English provider, and the other half was Spanish speakers with a Spanish provider. And I was able to compare and contrast these differences and the effect that a language barrier would have at each visit. And the questions that I originally had were if a basic medical Spanish course for healthcare providers would truly help, and something that was proposed back to me after I submit my project proposal made a good point that it might actually just risk creating overconfidence and new misunderstandings because I'm a Spanish interpreter, and sometimes interpreters and translators themselves make mistakes. So it kind of wouldn't be fair to expect, like if we were to offer a course or some sort of crash course material to providers, like it wouldn't be fair to expect them to have the knowledge that a certified interpreter or translator would. And that was one question at the start. Also, if the hospital should instead just prioritize better access to on-demand interpreters. Another question I had was, what training topics would be the most valuable for healthcare providers, and how would I be able to measure the effect that Spanish-speaking staff would have with a patient who only speaks Spanish, and how would I be able to compare it to English-speaking providers with English-speaking patients? And some more questions I had were, what type of resources could I offer to help bridge that gap for the language access for Spanish speakers? And how could I aid in implementing a lasting and meaningful solution? So just to comment on the progress that I've made so far with this project. For the first one, I think it would be better to focus on a way to research solutions that is patient-based and not something to add more responsibilities for these staff members and providers who are already flooded with a bunch of responsibilities every day. And
I thought that it would also be ideal for hospitals to have better access to on-demand interpreters, but sometimes it's not always feasible because of cost-effective reasons. It's just easier overall to get a contractor. You don't have to pay them benefits, and they're a lot more accessible nowadays. And also, some training topics that I found that I'm currently working on right now are registration, triage, chief complaints, and discharge instructions. So in my surveys, a lot of the questions were how satisfied they were with their care, if they fully understood uh, everything that was explained to them at the end of their consultation. And these were the areas that I found were the most question topics. And the third question, I found that one way to measure the effect of Spanish-speaking staff on only Spanish speakers would be to compare them to the English-speaking patients with English-speaking only staff. And then from there, I could kind of figure out if the issue was with a complex medical terminology in and of itself, or if it became hard to understand because of a language barrier. And I also found that what I'm working on right now is some translated infographics and pamphlets. I found that would be the best way to provide information to those patients that had the most questions or misunderstandings when it came to their care. And I have been able to find ways to provide some answers to the patients with the most frequently asked questions in that way after finding the results from the surveys. And so the new questions that I have now would be, to what extent were misunderstandings linked to the language barrier itself versus just complex medical information? And how much did the patient having the confidence to ask the questions, whether they spoke English or Spanish, affected the patient understanding? And also, how can hospitals monitor and measure whether language access is improving patient outcomes? And lastly, should hospitals view language access as a patient right or just a service offered? And that is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Should
Yeah. Well, thank you, all of you. You guys did an amazing job. And I think we have little tokens of our appreciation for all of your hard work. We have little either t-shirts for our new cohort, and then for our returnees, we got you something different this time for you. So if you want to come up to Rosemary, she will get them to you. And then if we could do a group photo in the front with all of our second annual cohort together with Dr. Whitty and Dr. McAllister, I think that'd be a great way to end it. So good job, guys. Let's give these guys another round of applause. Bring up here.
So it was like a shopper's really rude school. Yeah, maybe the market inside showed how
Yeah.
Misspelled in the pamphlet.
Her name was?
Yeah.
Oh my.
No, that's okay. I just wasn't sure if it was gonna go anywhere.
But we can change it too.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll make
For
sure.
your records, because it doesn't have another E after that.
Okay, my bad.
No, that's totally.
Yeah, I'll change that for you. That way next year, not in the future ones will have to change. If we do like keep adding to the list and have other things.
Yes, I saw it for that one.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, sorry about that.
No worries.
Sorry I came in late. I'm actually from the building.
Are you?
I just.
Oh,
So I'm new, so I was just.
No. Yeah. So what? Is if there's just a space. Facebook or you just get that. We're doing it.
No. Okay.
But yeah, no, otherwise we see.
Yeah.
Also, you guys take as much food and pizza as you want. But make sure we get a picture first. You don't leave yet.
I'll take that, right?
Yeah. No, you're good. I'm just. Yeah. All right, let's get in front. Let's get our picture done. So everyone in the front. To the front. To the front.
Is there a bag? Thank you so much.
Rosemary, can you take the picture? Cool.
I guess so.
Oh.
No pressure though.
Wow. Do you have anything to do with the U of A What Makes Us Wonder campaign?
Not really. I mean, what I did is really do it, not talk about it.
I love it.
You guys wonder, I don't think that what happens upstairs in the admin building about wondering.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's get one with the. Is there one more?
And we'll help you organize. We'll help you guys organize. Questionarium.
Thank you so much. Never mind.
Oh, Oh yeah, help me.
Hey, I'll do yeah. Like.
Yeah, no, thank you. Good job.
He was trash. He was right around.
Yeah. Go for it. Good job.
And actually,
You got someone to all.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Thank you. I do make. Yeah. That's right.
I saw you.
I'm sitting on that. Someone talked about it, but yeah. I heard about it.
Yeah.
Yes. Actually, forever ago.
It's all, yeah.
I know. I know.
Huh?
I think.
Yeah.
It's not gonna like this is like really strong around.
Maybe an eligibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Motion to you.
And I think so much. I hope I don't have to be a lawyer, but it might be. That's all my girl. Okay.
I like you're getting a description of it.
Yeah. So like I don't know.
Great. Have that.
Yeah, like a tweet. Yeah.
It's like this.
Yeah, we got it out here.
For the actual permit, I'm very grateful that you recorded it, so, yeah.
When it consent it.
It's always been provided.
Yeah, that's really your problem.
Like, part here, we need to have, it's been the one, yeah, so that's it.
Maybe that's why I got it, because like, you how we know that, yeah.
So, that's, yeah, I mean,
I really love this.
like.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do view more.
That's the restriction is.
And they can maintain.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And you guys are like,
Think, they were always like successful.
okay, you guys get
Now what happened?
Yeah, it's been great, like I love that being.
Yeah.
especially when you get such different.
So that's-
Yeah, I was just.
I think when I saw music, I was talking how it goes into.
Yeah, because first year we had this.
Yeah, I saw my daughter.
Anomaly.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly.
When you like go into the deal, you
But it's out.
narrow it so long.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but then it's funny you talk about that, but they're thinking the same thing about like.
No, that's why the question.
Which I don't care.
Yeah. Areas have the same question.
Yeah.
They should be
Yeah,
allowed.
no, thank you. Yeah, help yourself to anything on the way out.
You know, the conversation.
You think more. Help yourself.
But, great. Really wonderful.
Yeah, it was great.
You wanted to know whether they under. I think it's just.
University thing.
After construction pops up and they put the fences up, it's always one still, one year makes.
But they don't.
Okay, actually, can you hold on?
They suppress it, they don't even let you get.
When you get
talk
talk
about this time of year, they don't make money.
And I can turn.
Well, next year spirit gets better.
Great variety and actually a lot of community
Oh, yeah.
all get together, just because you question together.
Yeah.
But original, you had something in common. Whereas when we did the program before, questioning wasn't a theme, and I don't think the students really connected with each other. They presented and they had their posters and stuff like that, but they didn't really connect, but I noticed the moment, each time we did it, the moment.
Are these your
we
speakers?
Started talking.
Are these your speakers?
That's actually.
Well, we want to back it.
Right, like,
Yeah, exactly.
Do. But if you act as like a central group of students, I get the best thing back out there when you come done. You're gonna be more experienced than they are.
Oh,
You'll show them how to question. See, some of you didn't do 10 words, because it's really important to see if you can get your question down to 10 words. You should be able to. It doesn't have to be 20, 30, 40 words. Correct. You want it general.
Yeah, and make it so that everyone can understand.
Right, and then you can match it with other people, where it's too specific. Then it's hard for people to say, well, I'm not interested in that.
Right.
But they are interested in how cells differentiate
Yeah,
from each other.
yeah.
So there'd be a lot of people interested in that.
Yeah, this one, like, you know, like how universal comes together. How can you have universal processing? Or at the same time? Yeah.
Or how are things pronounced
Yeah.
differently?
Yeah.
There's a famous Russian joke about pronunciation, and I took Russian for 3 years because all my friends were chess players at the time and nobody could read the chess book. So that's why I did it. And it's Dasha, Dasha, Dasha. It's somebody walking down in Moscow, red light district, and he says Dasha, which is like the name for any girl, Dasha. And then he says Dasha, which is will you give or not? She says stop or be quiet about it. See, so it's Dasha is her name. Dash is when you give, I'm gonna give, and then she says, yes, Dash, and Sha.
Oh, that's good.
But it's all pronunciation.
Yeah, it's all, yeah. So I see that a lot on like social media. They'll be like, oh, like in this language, it's like the same word and you say it a bunch of times.
Yeah, and sometimes when you speak to people, you have the wrong pronunciation and it's a totally different meaning.
Yeah. Oh my, that happened to me when I was in Spain because I didn't realize that Julios were beans. Because it's pretty cool. It's Mexico. And so they're going, Julios, like, do you like Julios? And I was like, yeah, I like Jews. Like, where's this going? I was like, I guess, I don't know. Like what?
I never wondered that.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. But yeah, so that was interesting. For sure, yeah.
Well, it's good that those people aren't all going to medical school. They want to be orthopedic surgeons at the end. They say, I want to serve in an underserved.
Or rural community.
And they're all going to medical school.
Yeah,
The truth comes out, derm,
plastics. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was amazing.
We'll get together. This will be an annual, we'll have your names and everything. And maybe we'll just invite you to, every time we have a questionarium, any of you can come and jazz it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Here in Chapman, but yeah. Well, there's a whole jazz it up. Yeah.
Well, then I think my decal.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
See ya.
Pretty good.
Oh, thank you. And they really, when it was an original question, they really.
Some of them have other brands that are working.
Yeah, well, then that's okay, but this made the difference because they could travel with this, like one gallon in Spain. There was no other. She went to Spain to grab and before the. So this.
Am I a committee member?
I don't think did you get to review them?
I received them,
Okay, then you should be.
but I often don't respond.
Well, no, but you still should be on it. I was looking to see if I can see you.
Yeah, no, I received them. But you may need to reach out to Lance, figure out, I haven't heard from him. The last time we recorded hours was early February.
I would reach out to see if he's okay.
Well, no, I just, look, we texted and I don't know, he hasn't responded, so.
The only thing I
It's
can
been-
find out is.
It's been almost 2 months.
I can find out if you still know.
Well, that's amazing.
Well, I was, he's been enrolled half the semester.
So like 68
Would probably, it doesn't, he's already paid his tuition.
Well, no, but I might be going through the actual trip or something.
No, you can email him and just find out what his plans are for the summer, so. See if he responds.
But I can't buffer him.
No.
Oh, we can send him
I'm
the
trying to
annual
find out
survey.
what
We can
happened to
send
him.
the annual survey and write a personal note.
He's on the committee.
Oh, yeah, he did do it the first time around. He did do it.
Yeah, he's on the committee.
That's why.
Yeah.
I told you when my concern. Yeah, exactly. That's
Oh,
why.
I don't know, just that there's been absent or something.
Well, no, the law is very concerning.
But I don't know anything, all I know is that I haven't heard.
Right.
So, are you going home then?
Well,
Is your car here?
no, my car isn't here. Is your car here?
No, because that way, if I know where your car is, then I can just get your car whenever. If it's at home.
It's at home.
Then I'll just fit it.
But you're not doing it today.
I'll probably go over a little.
Well, then we club the people that can open.
No, they'll be there after 5, and I have a baseball game.
No, Neil, anyone, no, Rosemary will drive you home. You won't have any.
Well, yeah, there's like 4 by.
Oh, I think you're.
Oh, where's my package?
Oh, you ended up able to. You want it?
I would need a ride home.
Okay.
Like I'm ready ish now.
Oh, I gotta go put all this stuff away.
I don't, what do you have?
Pepperoni, I do something.
And tons of tacos.
Huh?
Tacos.
Lots of tacos. All the time. You want to keep saying we're going to take those? In fact, I prefer the closing. Okay, yeah. But everything else went, so before the rest of the taco, yeah. And you keep the tacos, you know. I want them all.
I'll start by local later.
Go try. And I'm not your lonely. But it's certainly the 30%. There are a couple. There were. Well, I just need to go pick all this stuff. What do you do? I need to go put all this stuff away and then I'll call you. Okay. In a few minutes. Well, I'll go down with Neil because right now I'm very wobbly.